Hey, good afternoon, everyone. If I can have your attention for just a couple of moments, please. Well, good afternoon. My name is Martin Phillipson, and as the Dean of the College, I am delighted to welcome you all here to celebrate Professor Ron Cuming's 50 years as a scholar and a colleague. There are very There are very, very few chances to celebrate a milestone such as this, so we're delighted to be able to celebrate his contributions to the College of Law with a reception and a conference in his honour. And we're delighted to kick off this event with a keynote address from the Honourable Mr. Justice Donald Layh from the Saskatchewan Court of Queen's Bench. Like many of you, Justice Layh was one of Professor Cuming's students, and throughout his career he's had the opportunity to work closely with Professor Cuming on a number of projects, including the Saskatchewan Enforcement of Money Judgments Act. Justice Donald Layh was appointed to the Court of Queen's Bench in June 2014. He's a graduate of the Universities of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, obtaining his law degree here in 1986. Highly influenced by Professor Cuming's Secured Transactions course and the advent of new personal property security law in Alberta and British Columbia in the late 1980s, he participated in many continuing legal education programs in those provinces. Trips to New Zealand and to the Supreme Court can also be attributed to his focus on personal property security law. He's authored A Legacy of Protection, the Saskatchewan Farm Security Act, History, Commentary and Case Law, and as mentioned before, co-authored with Professor Cuming the Saskatchewan Enforcement of Money Judgments Act. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Mr. Justice Donald Layh.
Good afternoon. It's so nice to look out into the audience and see so many familiar faces, and I know that we're all here to celebrate Ron. I'm not so sure how Ron feels about this, of course, as if anybody knows Ron, I'm sure that he's been griping to Elizabeth all week about the fanfare that is about to happen and the darn fuss we're making about this 50th anniversary. It's simply not Ron's character, of course, to seek fanfare. Boisterousness and self-promotion are very foreign to Ron, but accommodating others and encouraging others is, of course, a second nature. So the first thing, Ron, I want to do is to take the spotlight off you a wee bit, dim it slightly, and take some heat off you. Because although this weekend is certainly a celebration of your accomplishments, it is also in some measure about the rest of us. For as much as we want to and need to celebrate your achievements, I think I speak for many of us that we also have a need for this weekend. And that need is to express to you our deep personal and heartfelt gratitude. As many of us have matured in our own careers, whether as your university colleagues or as former or current students, members of the bench, practicing lawyers, we are appreciative that this weekend gives us a chance to stop, to reflect, and to thank you for making such a difference in our own careers and in the contributions you have made to this college and to this province. And I would not be going too far to say that that gratitude is felt nationally and internationally, since your work has had influence from individuals to nations. This weekend gives us the chance to thank you for the great difference you have made. This is something we want to do, and you will have little choice but to hear us out. So I have two themes to address this afternoon: the need to celebrate and the need to express gratitude. Celebration and gratitude. That is what draws us together this November afternoon at the College of Law, where you have spent the last 50 years. First, we must celebrate 50 years of teaching law. I promise we will not hoist you onto our shoulders and parade you around and sing for He's the Jolly Good Fellow. Maybe, probably not. But 50 years of an illustrious career is worth celebrating. And Ron, drawing on your insights primarily as a teacher, I invite you to consider that recognizing and celebrating your successes gives others the chance to dare to believe that they too can strive to reach similar accomplishments in their own unique way. Your light cannot be put under a bushel basket because you need to let others see that a rural Saskatchewan boy can make a mark in the world. As reticent as you might be about accepting this acclaim, your successes inspire another generation of Saskatchewan scholars. You have taught many in your lectures, but equally you teach as a model of what passion and intelligence can accomplish. So let's celebrate. Celebrating, by definition, requires a retrospective, a glancing back, a gathering up of achievements and milestones. In Ron's case, this retrospective shows a clear and discernible lineage of gifted scholars who have in turn inspired each other in the study of law. In this lineage, I start with Professor Jacob Ziegel, who taught Ron at the College of Law during Ron's law school days from 1959 to 1962. Professor Ziegel could not have known that he ignited a spark in a 20-year-old law student from Estevan, Saskatchewan, the son of the local sheriff, Charles Cuming. Ron was born August 19, 1940, in, get this, Inchkeith, Saskatchewan. Never heard of it. Where his parents farmed for a short term before moving to Estevan. When I learned that Ron had been in law school at the age of 20, I dropped him an email and said, "Ron, you were a baby in law school." And he sent me an email back and said, "Yes, I was, and I wasn't a big baby. I weighed 119 pounds." Ron, you must have been all brains and ribs. There wouldn't be room for much more. When I learned that Ron was in law school at that tender age, before Professor Ziegel, and Professor Ziegel, of course, lit this flame which flared into an open and burning flame for the next 5 decades. Jacob Ziegel introduced Ron to the American post-war innovation called Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code, and what we would later call the Personal Property Security Act. After a law school, Ron met Elizabeth Bruckner when she was nursing his ailing mother at Grey Nuns Hospital in Regina. Elizabeth was a true Saskatchewan prairie girl. She grew up on a farm, one of 2 daughters. She milked cows by hand before she got hooked up Black Beauty, to a buggy or a cutter and made her way to a 1-room country school. You tell me if Ron chose well when, in April of 1964, he married Elizabeth, a caring nurse and a resourceful farm girl. 52 years of marriage proves Ron and Elizabeth's compatibility. After a short stint in private practice in Estevan with George Hill's law firm, Ron enrolled in a master's program at Columbia University in New York City. With his 2 new passions, the law and his wife of 1 year, Ron and Elizabeth ventured to Columbia University in New York City, where he completed his master's degree in 1965-1966. Now, let's imagine this. 2 young Saskatchewan kids motoring across the continent to New York City in 1965. The Beatles had just been on the Ed Sullivan Show a few months previously. In 1965, the U.S. was ramping up its war in Vietnam. In April of that year, police used force to evict anti-war protesters at Columbia University. Racial tensions were high and volatile in all U.S. cities during the mid-1960s. 1965 was the year of the Great New York Blackout, when the power on the American Northeast Seaboard and all of central Canada were plunged into darkness. It was commonly said that 9 months later, New York had a baby boom. But Elizabeth assures me that their daughter Lynette was not born until 1968, followed by a son, Donovan, in 1970. And Lynette is here with her husband Brent and their daughter Maggie sitting beside Elizabeth. Elizabeth did, though, clearly recall the blackout. Ron, I did speak to Elizabeth and I pumped her for some information. She described New York in 1965 as violent, crude, and rude. The night the power went out, she was resting after getting off a nursing shift at St. Luke's Hospital when Ron came home from classes. They lived on a ground floor of a multi-floor apartment building on 123rd Street, just 2 blocks away from Harlem's Main Street on 125th Street. Concerned about the likelihood of vandalism during the blackout, they had seen purse snatchings right from their window. Ron was concerned that their ground floor apartment had no bars over the windows. He recalled that he had a camping hatchet in their car from camping en route to New York. Ron resourcefully dashed out to get the hatchet and returned through the foyer of the apartment, hatchet in hand. Only then did he realize what he looked like to a group of New York people standing in the foyer waiting for the power to come back on so they could go up the elevator. Elizabeth explained that after calming the women, he graciously and gallantly escorted many of them to their apartment suites. Anyway, I'm sure that Ron could never have anticipated that 50 years later, another young scholar from Saskatchewan would take his master's degree at Columbia University, studying an esoteric provision of the as then unthought of Personal Property Security Act that Ron would ultimately author. Or that this young scholar, Clayton Bankson, would be a colleague teaching commercial law 50 years later at the College of Law. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, for interspersed in this generational lineage, starting with Professor Ziegel, is another scholar, Rod Wood, professor of law at the University of Alberta for just about now 30 years. Rod had caught Ron Cuming's contagion while a student at the University of Saskatchewan during the early 1980s, I think probably the late 1970s, I might stand corrected, and would become the emissary of personal property security law in Alberta. It was there in the early 2000s that Professor Wood met Clayton Bankson, a young student from my hometown, Langenburg, Saskatchewan. A bromance over personal property security law unfolded yet again, as improbable as that must be. I've known Clayton even before he wore short pants. Clayton is the person sitting over on the far side. His dad and I taught high school together. Isn't this Saskatchewan? Isn't it great? We all interconnect at some point. Just listen long enough and it'll happen. A couple of years after graduating from law school at the University of Alberta, Clayton returned home to Langenburg, bought his grandmother's house, and practiced law with me for 2 years. I was immensely impressed when Clayton, among 273 master's students at Columbia University, was awarded the highest GPA in his graduating class. Clayton is now completing his doctorate of laws under Professor Wood's supervision and teaches with Ron, forming a strong commercial contingent at the College of Law. I have named Clayton the Second Coming. Well, he came sooner than the one who was supposed to be coming and never showed up. The fourth generation of PPSA academics at the College of Law. This lineage from Ziegel to Cuming to Wood to Bankson is but one branch of the great commercial law genealogy that Ron has created. I was speaking to Justice Georgina Jackson a couple of weeks ago. She explained to me that she can draw a direct line from each milestone of her career to some experience or influence or invitation that in some way Ron made available to her. So Ron, both our gratitude becomes generational, for without your influence, we might not have had a young and enthusiastic scholar like Clayton Bankson or an eminent Canadian jurist like Georgina Jackson. I know many others would say that but for Ron Cuming, their legal careers would have had a profoundly and undoubtedly diminished direction. Professors Tamara Buchwald, Rod Wood, Catherine Walsh, whose plane I think is somewhat late, among many others, have been the beneficiaries of Ron's magnanimous and generous leadership and inspiration. I too trace much of the enjoyment and success of my legal career to Ron's infectious indoctrination. Graduating from law school, familiar with the revolutionary concepts of personal property security law, I became the go-to person at our law firm at Robertson Stromberg. Ron Cuming, Rod Wood, and I participated in many in-services for the new act being introduced to BC and Alberta. I taught personal property security law at the bar course for many years. I know without these experiences, I would not have had the opportunity to go to New Zealand to in-service its new PPSA. I am certain I would have not understood the historic incompatibility between Federal Bank Act and the Personal Property Security Acts, and would have missed an occasion to go to the Supreme Court of Canada representing 2 small credit unions against 2 chartered banks. Nor would have I had the privilege to co-author with Ron the annotation of the new Enforcement of Money Judgments Act. Nor would I have joined the College of Law as an associate professor in 05-06. I recall, too, when the Minister of Justice, Donald Morgan, asked if I would chair the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan. I accepted with two conditions: that he would consider also appointing Mike Mullaney, who is sitting behind Georgina Jackson, and Professor Cuming. Minister Morgan replied, "Do you mean Ronald Charles Chester Cuming?" "That would be he," I said. So it came that Ron, Mike, and I joined Justice Jackson and others on the Saskatchewan Law Reform Commission, yet another intersection of those so closely tied to Professor Cuming. As a student, some years ago, we enjoyed inventing different monikers for Professor Cuming. That's when you should get nervous, Ron. I don't think we knew he was Charles Chester, but we came up with our own variations: RCQC, RC raised to the third power, or RC cubed. And you should know that Ron has powers well beyond a mere rational academic. We all think Ron would eschew notions of telepathy, astrology, witchcraft, clairvoyance, and the like. He is decidedly, after all, a left-brained, logical, rational man. Don't be fooled. His influence transcends the rational into the paranormal. Let me explain. In March of 2005, my wife Jan and I were traveling in India. I was alone in New Delhi one afternoon, and after leaving a restaurant, I saw two sari-clad, bejeweled astrologists squatting in the shade of a tree. I approached them. They asked me for my good name. Everybody has a good name in India, and I said Don. They immediately said, "Mr. Don, you're a Cancer." Well, I know enough about horoscopes to know that I am a Cancer. I asked them how they knew. They smiled, and with that characteristic quirky shake of their neck, as Indian people do, said, "Just how daft are these Westerners?" I had time that afternoon, and since a fortune-telling in India costs about $1, I thought, why not? They asked for the exact date of my birth, drew a few charts on a dirty notepad, looked at the palm of my hand, and began. "You like to travel." Well, okay, I'll give you that one. They became more detailed. Among the predictions was a particularly fanciful one. They said that in September I would be relocating to a new residence because of a new career opportunity. Well, having moved back to Langenburg after 8 years of practice in Saskatoon, and after establishing a very enjoyable practice over 10 years in Langenburg, and building a new home on the Assiniboine River Valley where Ron and Elizabeth have joined us, you can see the improbability of me coming to the college. Later that afternoon, I met Jan, and I told her that we would have to move in September. She teased that any move would be with my new stupid wife. I teased back, saying if she were stupid and 25 years old, I would probably struggle through the move. Well, 2 days later, we arrived home, and I returned to my office. Among my emails was one from Professor Cuming. I remember it verbatim because it startled me so. It said this: "Don, the College of Law is looking for a qualified commercial law professor. Your name has immediately come to mind. Have you thought of a temporary or permanent change of career? We have a position available in September." I immediately called Ron and asked him if he had received a telephone call from a couple of swamis in India. I told Ron I was flattered by the invitation, but I was extraordinarily happy and busy in my practice. He was gracious. I told him I was coming into Saskatoon the following week, and he suggested I drop in for coffee. Well, I need not go into detail about Dean Cotter being there, assurances of a student assistant to help me work on a book project, an ability to teach half-time and try-out teaching, and a generous offer of Ron's materials for secured transactions, etc., etc. Cutting to the chase, I bought a condo in Saskatoon, obediently moved, without a 25-year-old stupid wife, and for that matter, without a 50-year-old wife as well, and spent a year at the College of Law. Professor Cuming has wily ways. Don't underestimate his influence. He communicates with soothsayers, astrologists, and swamis. He will have his way. Ron, I know there are many of us here who can relate stories of your influence in our lives. One of the greatest experiences in teaching high school for 4 years happened several years later, as I was the teacher, when a student whom I had coached and encouraged thanked me for the confidence I had shown in his ability. The next words he said were profoundly affecting. Where would I be if Don Layh had not come to Langenburg to teach school? That statement jarred me. And this afternoon, Ron, I say the same thing. How different would my career have been if instead of attending at the University of Saskatchewan Law School and meeting Professor Ron Cuming, I had gone to the University of Manitoba, which was my original intention. Ron, can you imagine me practicing law, PPSA law in Manitoba? We often have these discussions. How many legally trained persons in Saskatchewan could say the same thing? When my judicial colleagues and friends knew I was asked to bring this commemorative speech, I received several comments. This one is from Donald Buckingham, a former student and faculty member at the College of Law. Unlike many of his students, I was able to become a colleague of Ron's during my time at the College of Law. And as his colleague, it became crystal clear to me that Ron was a man of great competence, of great character, and a great mentor to a young faculty member like me. Devin Dubois, a relatively recent student who articled and practiced with me in Langenburg, wrote this email. Professor Cuming's academic prowess and grit is only superseded by his genuine kindness and accessibility. As a subpar student, I failed to recognize the academic genius available to me in Professor Cuming's debtor-creditor class. A solid C grade is proof of my indifference. But in a few short years of practice, wherein I found myself deeply entrenched in matters of debt, credit, and property, I discovered the invaluable treasure of having ready access to perhaps the world's foremost expert in commercial matters through a simple phone call. Despite my C-grade status, Professor Cuming was indifferent to my mediocrity and was always kind and willing to discuss our real legal quandaries, asking nothing in return, although the odd bottle of scotch might have traded hands. What amazed me most was that he displayed the same level of passion when discussing a priority scrap over some Saskatchewan combines as he did a potential change in international banking law. In a profession and academic field rife with pompous, big city experts who are inclined to talk down to the world of practitioners, we've harbored a genuine world-class expert in our midst, with little fanfare and even less pomp. Professor Cuming should be applauded for his genuine Saskatchewan kindness and humility as much as his academic renown. Justice Sean Smith dropped me an email. I clearly remember in the academic year, 73-74, Professor Cuming's genuine excitement in teaching us about a new system of secured personal property based loosely on the American UCC. I was reminded of Professor Cuming's pedagogical enthusiasm when a few years ago he lectured to the en banc about the Enforcement of Money Judgments Act. He evidenced the same verve as he did roughly 40 years earlier at his secured transactions class. Please add my name to the long list of those who admire Professor Cuming and are, in fact and in law, indebted to him. And from Chief Justice Marty Popescu, Professor Cuming was an excellent professor. I remember going to the 100th anniversary of the Supreme Court of Canada. They had a number of distinguished speakers, including Michael Ignatieff, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and you guessed it, Ron Cuming. Justice Thal emailed me. I was fortunate enough to have taken some commercial law classes from Professor Cuming. He was absolutely one of the best professors I ever had. I know that Ron has taught many students as well as their children. Offhand, I know of at least a half dozen examples of parent-child students, including my own daughter, Avery. She practices largely in debtor-creditor and judgment enforcement law. I wonder if during this weekend someone might know of 3 generations that Ron may have taught, since 50 years of teaching could easily span 3 generations. Ron, imagine saying to a law student, "I taught your grandmother." Ron, I don't know if you believe in the afterlife, but having so passionately taught for 50 years, you have left a legacy that has touched so many in ways that continue to unfold and to be revealed. Teachers come close to touching eternity. Neither you nor we know where your influence will stop. I canvassed the judges of the Court of Queen's Bench and the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal and found that one judge on each court had not been instructed by Professor Cuming. Can any academic in the history of English common law claim such impact? I also did a casual Canley website search of Ron's name. I found over 260 Canadian citations of Ron's work on this one website, including 12 from the Supreme Court of Canada, 81 from Saskatchewan, 77 from Alberta, and Ron 2 from Manitoba. I found several citations from New Zealand and countless academic articles referencing Ron's publications. I then searched Ron's name and added the phrase, quote, "with all due respect." And we all know what that phrase means. And found none. Could it be, Ron, that with nearly 300 judicial citations, no judge has disagreed with you? Is there another academic in Canadian history who has received such judicial adulation? Ron's resume is 12 pages long of briefly described articles, books, and papers he has authored. I am sure if you lined them up, sentence after sentence, they would encircle the globe. Did you know that as recently as this fall, Ron published a book, Overview of Saskatchewan's Real Property Security Law? And in a word, and thank you, Ron, for the copy, it's brilliant. This book represents a trifecta of prominent and lasting excursions Ron has made into Saskatchewan's commercial law. He has reformed personal property security law and judgment enforcement law, and now he is poised to reform the law of real property. Watch. Within a generation, we will talk about real property security interests and cast aside the term mortgage, as distantly as we have cast aside the term chattel mortgage. Ron, you may weigh a few more pounds now than you did in law school, but you are a giant in Saskatchewan law reform. You've always punched well above your weight in legal circles. And you should know that Ron, unlike so many academics, is otherwise useful, too. Elizabeth tells me he's a darn good carpenter, has built handsome oak furniture, does all their plumbing and electrical work, is a fine mason and a winemaker. No absent-minded professor is he, relegated to changing light bulbs and taking out the trash. Ron, do you remember when I was at the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal several years ago and called you crying, well, almost literally crying, that I had lost a case when I'd argued that calves born of cows weren't their proceeds? My friend Chris Boychuk was arguing a case after me, and every few years he reminds me how painful it was to watch me present my case, dismissed from the bench, with the respondent being told that he need not present an argument. Now, for the record, Justice Jackson was not on that panel. Ron was incredulous, but leapt to action. A deft call to the Department of Justice, probably to Darcy McGovern, I'm thinking, who's also here, and an amendment to the definition of proceeds suddenly appeared in Saskatchewan's PPSA, and it remains the only Canadian PPSA with that provision. And the amendment is a great marker for Saskatchewan's influence. When I was in New Zealand helping to introduce its new Personal Property Security Act, I noted that act had the unique Saskatchewan provision in it. The New Zealand lawyers thought it was tremendously humorous how the amendment had come about. Australia's new PPSA has the same provision, a testament to my ability to lose a very simple argument, Ron's ability to fix it, and the consequences seen on the far side of the globe. Oh, did I mention Ron's generosity, his willingness to share, to enable and empower others? Ron must have missed the episode of the old television drama Dallas, when the oil mogul Jock Ewing said to his two sons, "Boys, power isn't something you share, it's something you take." Sounds like Donald Trump. Ron, to the contrary, fundamentally understands that power, whether you call it well-being or influence, is something that is in unlimited supply. Unlike Jock Ewing, Ron thinks that power and influence is something you give freely and repeatedly, without expectation of return. So, Ron, in concluding, I use the trite phrase that I am honored and privileged to have been asked to open this weekend celebration. Let me say, at least, I am highly, highly honored and greatly and immeasurably privileged because I know so many others here this afternoon have had many experiences to share. Gratitude and celebration. I once heard that feeling gratitude without expressing it is like wrapping a present without giving it away. So, Ron, this weekend is our emphatic expression of gratitude to you. And as we know, we celebrate too little in our busy lives, whether successes in long careers, long marriages, or outstanding accomplishments, all of which apply to you. But we should celebrate those things that we want to see more of. That is what this weekend is about. And I remind all here this afternoon that this is not a retirement party. It's merely a celebration of Ron's first 50 years at the college. We all hope you go a long way into your second term. Ron, you will know, being a young man from the coalfields of Estevan, what happens when you put coal under pressure. It turns into a diamond. You have become a gem to this province, and we take great pride in claiming you as ours. Ron, thank you for 50 years of teaching at the college, a gift to each of us, whether you're students, the college, the university, the courts, the province, or indeed the country. May your career continue and your health endure for many, many more years.
Well, I'm not even going to attempt to follow that wonderful speech. I'm going to present a little gift to Justice Layh on behalf of the college, and I'm going to invite you to head down to the Denton Student Lounge where we can toast Ron and celebrate his 50 years. So please join me in thanking again Justice Layh.